About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to our first politics live stream of 2025. And I'm beamed in by satellite, live from sunny Sao Paulo, by Ciara. Hi, Ciara, how are you doing?
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks. Good to see you. And we're starting with the core political ideas, aren't we? This half term, and just going to work through them, and I think we're going to be looking at conservatism today. So we've got a range of activities which we will look at. So if you are watching live, and it's great that some of you joining us, that's great. You can join in with these activities in the chat window, and we'd really encourage you to do so. Take a risk on the answers. You know, no one's watching. they are, but you know, it's fine. The whole point is to get involved. Some of the questions are deliberately meant to be a bit tricky or whatever, and that's absolutely fine. So do join in. If you're watching on catch up, obviously you can't join in with the live chat, but you can still play along with the activities, and you might be able to give yourself a bit of extra time by pausing the video and things like that. Shall we get on with it?
Yes, sounds good.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think we are starting with a quick 60-second challenge. So this is a sort of key term activity just to get us started. So if you're playing along, we've got key terms down the left. We've got some definitions down the right. The key terms are letters. The definitions are numbers. So if you could try and link the number to the letter within 60 seconds, that would be marvellous. And just before I get going, there are one or two where the words are have quite similar meanings, and so I could see one or two where you might go for one, and then as you're going through, think, oh, actually, maybe that's that one. So don't worry about that if there are one or two which are very much related terms. That's perfectly normal. Okay, so we've got 60 seconds. Hopefully, a bit of music will come on to show us the time counting down. See how you get on. Oh, it's the dramatic music. Okay. Now people have been a little bit shy in the chat window. That's okay. You don't have to necessarily do them all. If you can do one or two of them, that would be great.
Yeah, and it's good to do these kind of keywords activities because obviously when you do your exams, you have to be able to understand what the question's asking you. And sometimes in the
Absolutely.
exam, they might ask you a specific keyword, like to what extent do conservatives agree on pragmatism, for example,
Yeah.
for EdXL.
Yeah. Absolutely. And and then in for AQA students, you might have some of these words in the sources, and being able to understand what the sources are about is very useful for all of you. You want to use these words in your answers and demonstrate that your knowledge. It's always better to use these kind of key terms from the spec rather than kind
Yeah,
of talking around them. It demonstrates the knowledge. Obviously, you need to show that you understand them too. Okay,
absolutely.
hopefully another question will get you answering. But we'll run through this one, shall we? Shall we solve it? Shall we show the solved wall and then talk through them that way? Probably makes sense.
Sounds good.
So
Yeah.
here we go. So we've got tradition, the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. Obviously, there's other ways you could define tradition, but this is the sort of traditional conservative view
Very
of,
conservative.
yeah.
Yeah.
Noblesse oblige. This idea that the elite has a responsibility to take care of their social inferiors for those, for the people below them in society. Obviously that's linked very closely with paternalism, and wouldn't necessarily have been surprising if people had got those two mixed up as they were going through the definitions. Hierarchy, a clearly stratified society in which people know their rank or status. An organic society. Sociologists would know that as well from functionalism. That's always a good one. And particularly for conservatives, it's the idea of, yes, they believe in an organic society, but the idea of organic change, isn't it? Sort of a natural, slow, gradual change. Paternalism, the government acts in the interest of its people like a kind father. Laissez-faire, which we also associate with liberalism, of course, but and here it's the sort of free market idea. The state should not interfere in the economy, leave to the free market. As with all of these, not all conservatives will equally believe in these things. As I will talk about this in more depth in a moment, but there are some disagreements within the ideology, of course. Libertarianism, again on that sort of free market, small state end of things. A minimal state, giving freedom and autonomy to individuals. And then pragmatism, a flexible approach, do what works rather than follow a strict ideology. Which does lead to that lovely question about whether conservatism is an ideology at all.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's get out for it being so different, isn't it? It's a way of thought. It's pragmatic. It moves. It ebbs and flows. Or doesn't move.
Perhaps not. Okay, let's have a look at another activity. Again, I hand over to Ciara for this one called the lineup. I like this one. I reckon.
I like this one a lot. Yeah. So there's basically four clues that you're going to get, and you're trying to work out which person are the clues referring to. So we've got here four of the key conservative thinkers. We've got Oakeshott, Rand, Hobbes, and Burke. And you're going to see, because obviously with these the reason why conservatism is an idea or an ideology is because the thinkers are somewhat connected. So there should be similarities between them, but it's just one thinker that we're looking for here. So which of these four clues just lead to one thinker?
So on that point, just on the encouraging people to get involved, it's likely you'll change your mind as you get more clues on this, but have a go on the first one, even though then a later clue you might think, oh no, it can't be them, it might be someone else. Okay.
Yeah, I tried to make this tricky as well.
It is. I think it's a good one because
and
it is
then I
tricky.
looked over it today and I was like, oh god, now I'm not sure. But yeah, I was too clever. Okay, so this person believed that the state is essential to uphold the rule of law. So that's an interesting one. Can't trust individuals, need to have the state to uphold the rule of law.
Yeah. Now there's some you'd immediately think of that this would be true of. I'd be tempted to think that this is something maybe that they all agree on.
Yeah, I mean, even liberals, right, would agree on this too. So maybe it's a mean clue.
Well, it's a nice general clue, isn't it? I think it's a good point you mentioned earlier. There must be some stuff they all agree on, otherwise they wouldn't be an idea, would they? And that's the thing to remember. There's always going to be some stuff they agree on because that's what makes them all conservatives. And there's always going to be some stuff they disagree on because if there wasn't, then there wouldn't be these different strands. So that's the starting point. Yeah, so that's always the starting point. You're going to find points of agreement and disagreement. It's just how much there is. Yeah, should we have a look at another clue?
Yes. Okay, so their conservatism was formed in an era of radical ideas. Oh. Okay. This is when I was like, oh, actually, this applies to quite a few of them.
Well, it does really, doesn't it? I mean, I suppose when we think about all the eras, are there any eras where there weren't any radical ideas? No, they weren't considered to be eras of radical ideas. I suppose if people were writing in the... No, I don't know. What year would you say that's... What years would you say that's not an era of radical ideas? I know what you were going for. But if you think about all of these, Oakeshott was writing at a time, maybe not of radical ideas, but certainly of extreme political extremes. You had dictatorships around the world and all that kind of thing. But perhaps most of them were fairly established during most of the time Oakeshott was writing, so maybe not that radical. Rand definitely writing during a time of radical ideas. Hobbes definitely writing at a time of radical ideas. Burke definitely writing at a time of radical ideas. So
Hobbes was born during the Spanish Armada and then died with the English Civil War. So he had quite a rough one, didn't he?
A lot of radical ideas going on. But of course, Burke was writing around the time of the French Revolution and revolutions across Europe and the early days of radical liberalism and stuff was around. So lots of radical ideas. Well, most of them were writing probably. So we probably still need to narrow it down further, don't we?
Definitely. We might be able to get rid of one. Let's see if the third clue can get rid of him. So they argued that humans are self-interested, often driven by irrational desires.
Now that one's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if we just had the first half, had the first half, we could probably say maybe they all think that too. Maybe these conservatives agreeing more than we thought. But irrational, I would think, probably rules out Rand, doesn't it? Rand. I mean, I suppose Rand would think that people sometimes are driven by irrational desire, but she wouldn't think that self-interest was irrational. She thinks self-interest is rational, and that's a good thing to work in your own. Good, sensible, rational thing to work in your self-interest. So we've probably ruled out Rand, and we kind of thought maybe we'd ruled out Oakeshott before.
So it's just between potentially Burke and Hobbes now, right? Okay. Okay, so they believed human beings have no right to freedom and individual choice.
Good heavens. I've got a bit of an echo coming on now. I think I'm hearing myself through your speakers as well, Ciara, but it's okay. I suddenly heard an echo. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Burke surely wouldn't think they had no right to freedom and individual choice. As a believer in parliamentary democracy to a certain extent, and so does that narrow us down?
Yeah, I mean, technically, I guess Burke did think that too, didn't he? But
Not to the same extent.
not to the same extent. It's more radical, this person's ideas. It's literally you have no right to anything. You signed a social contract, so there's no, the monarch has no obligation to listen to you, so you should just give him the power that he needs, which would mean it could only be,
Hobbes.
well, where's Hobbes?
It's a good activity, that I like that, particularly when the clues could apply to a few of them as you go along, and it takes a while to narrow it down. I like that.
Yeah.
And it's great to spot these areas of agreement as well as disagreement, because I think quite often students tend to focus on the disagreement, understandably, because that sort of feels like the more that feels like where the debate is, where the discussion is, where the meat of an argument could be. But it's you don't want to neglect the fact that they do also have shared ideas and do agree about some stuff. Okay. Oh, Ciara, you've got the new right is an outlier in conservatism.
So this
Debate.
actually links nicely on, actually, because that's exactly the same. Like I've always found the disagreements are easier to find than the agreements, but when you actually really start thinking about it and understanding the ideology, and you start thinking about where there are agreements, it can actually be quite fun to pick those apart. So I thought this activity could be quite good, because sometimes when I'm looking at the spec and I'm like, how come the new right is in there? Like, isn't this not just neoliberalism? It's quite good to try and pick out the agreement. So I've put this debate as the new right is an outlier in conservatism. It kind of basically doesn't belong there. So can we think of 2 or more reasons for why the new right might not actually fit too comfortably within conservatism?
Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened there. I've done something to the screen. I don't know how to undo it. Bear with me.
So you could just put anything like down in the chat as well, anything that you can think of. That it basically conservatives don't really agree that much. Like the new right, sorry, doesn't agree. Burke and Rand are totally different people, for example.
Yeah,
Show business, Duncan. That's how it is.
it is. This is one that's never happened. Oh, hang on, it's happened on there. This is something that's never happened before, so it's always interesting to do something different. Oh gosh, well we've given away, but at least we've got some of the screen back. If I really don't know what happened there, I do apologise. I'll try never to do that again. Okay. But we've given some answers away to the first bit, which is good, really. So we've got Rand believes humans can be rational, which we'd already talked about that, haven't we, a little bit?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Rational self-interest, as you said earlier.
And then we've also got this idea of the free market breaking the organic society. You want to just talk a little bit around that? Explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's kind of linking organic society and noblesse oblige together a bit and thinking, well, if it's that everybody's got a place in society and a role in society, and the role is for the nobles or those with power to look after those without it, the free market can in some ways undermine that, because it's not necessarily about redistributing resources to make sure that there's kind of a relative level of stability for all people in society, but actually it can be the accumulation of wealth at one end and the lack of it on the other.
Yeah, very good. And it's it's interesting. I mean, we don't, certainly for EdXL, don't really talk about the contemporary conservatism when we talk about this, although you might do for AQA a little bit. It's interesting looking at what's happening in America at the moment and the conservatives, shall we say, that are in the government, and this sort of this kind of disruptor idea of the sort of Elon Musks and things like that, and the idea of free market is quite, there's a people benefit from the kind of disruption that comes from it, and it's that's not very conservative, or certainly not very traditionally conservative.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And those billionaires at the inauguration, like, do they have a social obligation to help the poor?
yeah,
Well, actually, we know with free market capitalism, they're able
yeah,
to say, well, we're going to not pay as much tax because we're creating jobs instead. And
yeah,
of course, job creation is important,
yeah, yeah,
but it's breaking that kind of contract or the organic society in that way.
yeah,
Interesting to see shapes.
yeah, yeah. The other side of the argument, I suppose, is the interesting one, isn't it? Why are they? Why are they conservatives then? What
Yeah,
we're
I think
saying
this
here
one is
is they
always tough,
aren't they
isn't
just
it?
liberals? Aren't they just liberals? What makes them conservatives?
Yeah, very much so. Like there must be something they have in common, right? The specifications aren't just going crazy putting the new right there. The new right, I believe, definitely does belong in conservatism. I just think you have to make kind of a more creative case for it, and I think it's bigger than the economy. There's other reasons for it.
Here we're talking about the new right in general rather than specifically the key thinkers, although you can, of course, I think, make a case for why Rand and Nozick are also potentially conservatives. But the new right is more than neoliberal economics, even if not necessarily some of the stuff we associate with the new right, Rand and Nozick necessarily particularly are associated with. But if we think about new right more generally as an idea beyond the thinkers, there might be a bit more that they have to say. Anyone gonna put in the chat window why? What makes the new right conservative?
I
Give me
like
a
what you
few.
said earlier about Rand. So we said that the new right is an outlier because Rand believes humans can be rational, but that kind of goes against conservatism because we are irrational and self-interested. But she's saying, as you said, they are rationally self-interested. So that kind of human nature thing still stands. It's maybe a slight deviation, but it comes back to it, right? That we are all horrible, selfish people. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, according to Rand.
Yeah, so I suppose Rand wouldn't necessarily do the horrible bit. Although when you read some of what she writes, she sort of says she believes in individuals but is constantly disappointed by them or something. So I think there's a quote along those lines somewhere. So maybe she wasn't quite as optimistic about human nature as she sometimes is presented as being. And certainly Nozick writes some things about the problems of while he's very libertarian, there's still has a clear role for the state. He's not an anarchist. We said why aren't they liberals? There's the other question: why aren't they anarchists? I suppose is another part of this.
Something you can ask for both ideologies as well, right? Like, so there's going to be something that connects them then, and that might be connected to not being anarchists. How could we phrase that in a way that fits along with what we've studied in our classrooms?
Shall we have a look? Shall we see
Yeah.
what you put? Yeah. So we've got.
So yeah, the idea then that, as Duncan said, they're not anarchists. Well, yeah, they all all conservatives believe in the need for a state. They might have varying degrees on how strong that state is. Is there economic regulation or not, for example? But ultimately, they believe that the state should be there to protect us from each other. Sometimes, even with a rational human nature, people can go too far, so they need to be regulated, tough on crime, that kind of thing. And then this one's a bit of a cop out, but it works, I think, for practically every answer. Conservatism is a pragmatic way of thought, not a rigid dogmatic ideology. So they're changing to conserve to fit with the times. They don't want to become an irrelevant ideology that nobody votes for the parties who represent it. So maybe Thatcher became neoliberal in some aspects, but it was only to preserve the conservative ideas in society. And she was pretty successful in doing that.
Yeah, that's an interesting, wasn't it? The idea that, and I think a lot of people present, say someone like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, they're quite ideological politicians in many ways, but you could sort of make this argument that, it's not so much that people were committed to a sort of neoliberal ideology, but that this was a pragmatic response to the realities of the economic and political situation in the 70s and 80s that they were sort of responding to. And then we do have also this idea that the new right combines that neoliberal economics with a kind of neoconservative approach to other aspects of society, which links to this idea of the state, strong law and order, also things like defence of the realm, perhaps quite nationalistic, perhaps quite conservative socially on things like, and this isn't true of, say, Rand, for example, but it's true of the new right more generally on things like family values and all that kind of thing. Quite traditionalist in that sense. So there's definitely a case to be made that the new right is very conservative, while also being quite radical, which is, or at the time when it was new, was quite radical, which might seem like a contradiction.
Right? It is a revolutionary force, and when you think about it economically, it definitely did. It totally disrupted the economics of the countries where it was implemented, and the world now, because it was to some degree successful. So it is really interesting, and I think that's it. You can split it into the economic values of conservatism, but also the social values. And I think socially conservatism has stayed on that path of, like you said, the family, paternalism, and things like that.
Absolutely. Okay, let's have a look at another activity now. Now this is another one I'll hand it to Ciara. We've been talking about the new right, but let's go back to our traditional conservatives and have a little bit of a chat about Edmund Burke.
And a throwback to the COVID bubbles. So basically, one thing to think about with our different thinkers is they obviously have lots of different ideas that can be attributed to them. So how many ideas can you remember from Edmund Burke? What were his kind of key ideas? Try and list anything, just even one, just drop it in, and as many as you can think of. And then we're going to reveal the ones that we've put there, and you can see if there's anything that you had that was missing.
So you can just make a note for yourself and see and compare them with ours. But this is a good one to get involved, I think, on the chat window. You're bound to remember some key terms that you would link to Burke. They might not be the same ones that come up for us, and that's fine. So jot a few down into the chat window. We'll give you a minute or so just to jot a few ideas down. Go on, who's going to be the first to be brave and do it? I might put one in just to kick things off. I'm going to put one in which I can't remember if it's on there, but I'm thinking probably isn't. So I'm going to just to try and start things off. There we go. I've made a
yeah, that's not on there, actually.
No, I made a sort of British politics bit link.
Good segue.
Democracy and participation connection. I'm being synoptic, but
yeah, you did definitely just say that, the trustee model of representation. Your politician, what's he say, denies you of his industry or something if he says what you think. If he acts as your mouthpiece.
Owes you his judgment and not. Yeah, I can't remember the exact. There's a good quote there, but it's more of a quote for types of representative democracy than his conservatism. Although you can link it to his conservatism, because obviously this idea that a politician knows best, essentially, which kind of it's kind of you're electing them to use their judgment, is part of that kind of paternalistic sort of approach. So you definitely can bring it in.
Which he used geniusly to improve his stock in the East India Company and get the British government to take over half of the company. All of the shareholders.
Everyone's being a bit shy. Shall I Shall we try and come up with some and see if they're the ones? You see if we can remember what was up there. You've probably got a list in front of you. I haven't, so I'm going to see. Okay, might be one to do with tradition.
Definitely loves a bit of tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe natural aristocracy could be
Yeah.
there, or
Yeah.
natural hierarchy. There could.
That's to Burke, that's where the order is in society. By respecting these traditions, tried and tested institutions, creates order,
Yeah.
stability, and so does the hierarchy. In some ways, it's just easier if you just know what your position is, who you listen to, and who you tell what to do. Kind of like school.
Yeah. That bit about little platoons, love the little platoon to which you belong. I often find students want to bring that into answers and then are not quite sure how best to use it. You know, what did he actually mean by it? And I think it was more to do with that kind of idea of people knowing their places and things like that, rather than sometimes people use it almost like, oh, perhaps he was a syndicalist anarchist or whatever, and thought that people should be in small self-governing communes or whatever,
Oh,
which
wow.
it was not Burke's idea at all. No.
Yeah, because there is a happiness when you know where you fit, right? And sometimes freedom is not having choice because you don't have to make the wrong choices. You just sit with what you've got. So it is an interesting argument. Like freedom isn't necessarily choice, although I do prefer having choices. But sometimes
Yeah.
I don't, right? Like I'm sure with students, what A levels do you do? What GCSEs do you do? Those are quite horrible, stressful questions sometimes. So it's an
Absolutely.
interesting point of view.
Change to conserve, that might be there. Shall we start popping some bubbles and see what comes up?
Let's start
Okay.
with some bubbles. Yeah.
Okay. What have we got? Oh, contract between the living and the dead. We might talk about that again in a minute, so we'll maybe save that one for a moment. But it's an interesting one. It links to that whole idea of tradition and all of that. An organic society we've already mentioned. Oh, I think that should say anti-revolution.
Sorry,
What's that?
yeah, it should say revolution.
I don't know where the R's gone. That's interesting. It's not anti-evolution at all.
No.
Well, I suppose if he'd been around at the time when yeah, I don't think. Yeah,
We have to
no.
ask AI, would Burke have been
Yeah.
anti?
yeah. I suspect from his sort of religious perspective he might have been, but that's not the.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't know that.
Quite
That's speculation. It's anti-revolution. Okay. Tradition, gradual change, natural hierarchy.
Sounds fun at parties, doesn't it?
Yeah, paternalism, noblesse oblige. Good key term that. Okay, I'll just pop back to that one so we can see him. Apart from anti-evolution, which we don't want to do. Okay, we're going to have some quotations now, and we've blanked out some words. I'm not feeling particularly optimistic that people are going to try and finish these quotations, because I think this is one of the harder activities and people have not been brave on the others, but maybe first one, I reckon people out there will know it. It's just whether they feel like they can type it into the live chat window. Hobbes, quote from Hobbes, and the life of man solitary poor something and something actually.
I saw a comic once. I think I said this to you before, but a comic where they named the comic describing children as the last part of this quote. Kind of fits quite well.
I remember once, and this is it's a little bit mean really to the former Shadow Chancellor, but I remember a member of a Labour MP who will remain nameless describing John McDonnell as this, which I think was quite rude.
That's quite rude. Did he get in trouble?
Well, he didn't do it on the floor of the House, whatever.
Outside is absolutely fine. Of course, yeah.
Shall we have a look? It was nasty, brutish, and short. Very rude thing to say.
Great way to describe children. Poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Yeah. As in it's tiny ones. It's not 6 foot, of course.
Hobbes again. The condition of man is a condition of war of something. Might not know that. That one's probably a less famous quote than the first one, but still quite well known. A war of everyone against everyone. It's the idea that, again, in this sort of state of nature. People are just out for themselves, and life would be horrible. Burke
It's
now.
interesting, actually, depending on the version of the book you have, the
Yes,
translation, because the one
it
that
does
I
vary.
read was all against all. But I mean, it's the
Yes,
same thing. But it's all
yeah.
down to the translator, which is super interesting.
Burke here. A state without the means of some change is without the means of its own what? And we used a nice term earlier that we use to associate with traditional conservatism, but also probably one nation conservatism and the nature of change and pragmatism. It's without the means of its own conservation. So Burke isn't against change. He does think there has to be some change, and without that change, things can't stay. You need to change things in order to protect them and to keep them the same and to avoid violent disruption. Another Burke one, and this one links to something we had earlier. Again, you see slightly different versions of this quotation flying around, but society is indeed a contract, not just between the living, but who? We had it on the bubble thing about the contract between the living and the dead, but it goes slightly further than that. It's between the living, the dead, and those who are to be born. So it's it's about the past and the future, and that's a core point of his conservatism. It's conserving things for future generations as well, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, even the idea of the contract between the dead as well. Also, it's been called democracy of the dead as well, and it's an interesting one. Like, because obviously, if we're alive, we have the right to vote. But what about the people
Yeah.
who voted before us? Do we take them into consideration? I don't
Yeah.
know.
And it links to that kind of tradition idea and the collective wisdom of the past kind of thing, doesn't it? It's like people who went before were wise, and we shouldn't just try and make everything new all the time. And then we've got Rand, last one. Run for your life from any man that tells you that what? It's an unusual quotation to have, but an interesting one. Run for your
Could
life
go
from any
anywhere.
man
Yeah.
that tells you that money is evil. Yeah, it's an interesting one. She mentions this quite a few times in her writings about it. That the people who say that money's bad or money's evil or money's the root of all evil and things like that are flawed people. She often says it means that they've probably got lots of money and haven't ever felt the need to try and make some or whatever. But also, in this quote, I think she's also suggesting that they'd probably depend on the money of the woman, because I don't want to make any money because money's evil. So you'll have to pay for everything. It's probably probably part of the meaning behind that. Okay, talking of Rand.
So,
And it
a
links to
little bit
that
more
last
Rand.
one about New Right, but it's sort of looking at Rand individually now. Was she
Yeah,
a
so
conservative?
some people argue, oh, she's not a conservative, she doesn't belong there. And like we were saying earlier, she's more of a neoliberal and she would fit better in liberalism. But I don't agree. I think she is a conservative with some liberal elements. So I think the easier one to think about then is the way that she doesn't fit within conservatism, which is basically just kind of going over the stuff that we've talked about already today. So can we think of any ways that maybe she's not a conservative, she doesn't fit too tightly within the idea?
As you say, I think we have looked at some of these. We've got this idea that humans are rational, whereas traditionally conservatives saw humans as irrational, and we've got this sort of limited government free market economy that we've talked about as certainly not being what kind of traditional conservatives and one nation conservatives favoured. How is she a conservative then? Again, this is the trickier side of things, especially when we're talking about Rand personally rather than the New Right generally. She wasn't particularly neoconservative on kind of social issues either, really. I think she had relatively liberal views on things like sexual orientation and things like that. So, in what way is she a conservative?
So yeah, this one's definitely harder. But sometimes it's just good to do these things just for practice and getting your brain into that kind of mode of thinking before the exam, right? Where you've got time to think, and it's just a good exercise, I think.
When I'm saying she wasn't socially conservative, as I suppose I'm saying for her time, because it was obviously a more socially conservative time anyway. But if anything, she had relatively radical ideas on some social issues for the time when she was writing. So what makes her conservative? We've sort of hinted at a couple of things, haven't we? This idea of humans being self-interested. So although she's saying they're rational, part of her human nature bit still is quite conservative. And this idea of law and order to protect property rights, the importance of the police to protect property and protect people. Yeah, some of that is very Burke, isn't it? Really, it's just a different spin on it, a modern spin on it. Back to that pragmatic. Maybe it's just conservatism for a different era. Not particularly the era when she was right. It's interesting. The new right kind of became popular sort of a little later, and she was probably out of the kind of norm of conservatism at the time. Okay. We've got the idea of a strong state needed for social regulation and a pessimistic view of unregulated human nature. Okay, I'm going to come back to the thing. Thanks for that, normal curry muncher. They were quite Those the only contributions we've had, so I'm going to thank you for them. But they were
excellent. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ciara. I'm going to have to get off because we've got a sociology one coming on very soon. If you do politics and sociology, might see you there in a few minutes. Thanks very much, Ciara. We're doing this again. Is it next week for some liberalism? Yep. So we'll be doing some liberalism next week. So if you've found this useful, then do come and join us in. Okay. Cheers.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.